What would you do if the home you paid for just vanished? No keys, no refund, just a cold smile from a man in a suit telling you it was a misunderstanding. That's what happened to Leona Graves. But instead of walking away, she did something no one expected. She fought back. And in doing so, she uncovered a scheme far bigger than her own case. Before we dive in, let us know. What time are you listening to this, and where are you? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. Leona Graves had always believed in hard work. That's what her mother, Sandra, had taught her. Life wasn't fair. She learned that early. But if you kept pushing forward, eventually, you'd carve out a place for yourself. That's what today was supposed to be, her first real step into adulthood. The morning air in Chicago was crisp, carrying the scent of rain from the night before. The streets were already alive, cars honking, people rushing to work, a city always moving. Leona stepped off the bus, her duffel bag slung over one shoulder, a folder of paperwork in the other hand. This was it, her first apartment. She had worked 2 jobs for months to save enough for the deposit. Weekdays at Page and Leaf, the little bookstore that smelled of ink and old paper, and weekends at a downtown cafe, her apron always stained with coffee. It had been exhausting, but worth it. She replayed the moment she signed the lease in her head, the email confirmation from Ashwood Realty, a company with a prestigious reputation. Everything had been so official. There had been no reason to doubt them. Now, standing outside the Ashwood leasing office, a sense of unease crept in. She shook it off. She was probably just nervous. Inside, the air smelled of fresh coffee and expensive furniture polish. The receptionist, a woman with tightly pinned blonde hair, barely looked up from her screen when Leona approached. "Hi, I'm here to pick up the keys for Unit 8C. A pause. The woman frowned, typed something, then looked up. "There's no record of that unit under your name." Leona blinked. "That's impossible. I have the lease agreement right here." She pulled the papers from her folder, flattening them against the counter. The receptionist barely glanced at them. "That unit has already been rented to someone else." Silence. Leona's grip on the papers tightened. "There must be a mistake. I paid the deposit 2 weeks ago. I'm sorry, but the apartment is no longer available." Her heart pounded. The receptionist was acting like this was a minor inconvenience, not the single biggest financial commitment Leona had ever made. "So where's my money?" "The deposit is non-refundable." The words hit like a slap. "Non-refundable?" She took a step back, eyes wide. "That's not what the contract says." The receptionist let out a slow breath, like she had dealt with this before. "You'll have to speak with management." Leona was led into a sleek office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown Chicago. Behind a dark mahogany desk sat Bradley Kent. Leona didn't know much about lawyers, but she recognized his type. Crisp suit, cold smile, a man who made his living finding loopholes. "Miss Graves," he greeted smoothly, "I understand you're having some concerns about your lease?" She dropped the papers in front of him. "I don't have concerns. I have proof. You took my money. You owe me either an apartment or a refund." Bradley leaned back, fingers steepled. "Did you read the fine print?" Leona's stomach twisted. "What?" "Your contract contains a standard clause allowing us to cancel the lease if the unit becomes unavailable. Of course, we always try to accommodate our tenants, but," he spread his hands, "sometimes circumstances change." She couldn't believe what she was hearing. "So you just take people's money and rent the same unit to someone else?" "The deposit ensures consideration, not guarantee." It took everything in her not to throw something. "That's fraud," Bradley chuckled. "Fraud?" "No, Miss Graves. It's business." And then came the final blow. "Clever girl like you should know better than to sign something she doesn't understand." Leona left the building furious, not just at Bradley Kent or Ashwood Realty, but at herself. She had done everything right. She had read the lease. At least she thought she had. She had followed all the steps, played by the rules. And still, here she was, homeless. She took the bus back to Page and Leaf, where she worked the closing shift. The bell above the door jingled as she entered. the scent of books wrapping around her like an old friend. The owner, Mr. Holloway, looked up from behind the counter. "Something wrong, kid?" Leona hesitated, then forced a shrug. "Just a long day." She didn't know why, but she didn't want to say it out loud. Maybe because admitting it would make it real. Maybe because saying "I got scammed" would make her feel like a fool. Instead, she walked to the back of the store, grabbed a legal reference book, and sat down at one of the worn wooden tables. She opened her contract again, read it, and this time, she really read it. Her fingers traced the lines of text, the small print she had skimmed over before. Then something caught her eye, a single line buried in the middle of the contract, a clause that didn't match what Bradley Kent had told her. She frowned, flipping back to the emails Ashwood Realty had sent her. The wording was different, and not just different, intentionally misleading. Her stomach tightened. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't bad luck. This was a pattern. She pulled out her phone, typing Ashwood Realty's name into a tenant review site. And there they were. Dozens of complaints. People saying they had experienced the exact same thing. Deposits taken, leases revoked, money gone. Leona's pulse pounded. This wasn't just about her, and suddenly she knew exactly what she had to do. She would fight them, even if she had no lawyer, even if no one believed her, because if she let this go, then Ashwood Realty would keep doing this. Leona sat at the kitchen table in her tiny studio apartment, the glow from her laptop screen casting shadows on the walls. Her fingers hovered over the trackpad as she reread the email for the third time. "Your case has been accepted by the Cook County Court. A hearing date will be set within the next 3 weeks." She had done it. The legal system had actually taken her complaint seriously. For a moment, a flicker of triumph coursed through her veins, but it was quickly drowned out by a crushing wave of doubt. This wasn't just filing a complaint or demanding a refund anymore. This was a lawsuit against a corporation, against a team of attorneys, against Bradley Kent, who had years of legal experience and the full backing of a multi-million-dollar real estate empire. And she was just a 20-year-old bookstore clerk who had read a few legal guides at the library. Her stomach twisted. What if she had made a mistake? What if she wasn't as prepared as she thought? The thought of stepping into a courtroom, standing in front of a judge, with people in suits tearing her apart over a contract, it was terrifying. But then her phone buzzed. She almost didn't answer, but when she saw the name on the screen, she hesitated. Miriam Torres. She clicked accept. "You got some guts, kid," Leona exhaled, gripping the phone tighter. "Does that mean you'll help me?" Miriam sighed on the other end. "I don't take cases unless I think they have a shot. And honestly, I'm still not sure about yours. But I see something in you. Determination. A willingness to fight." Leona's chest tightened. So, I'll take the case." She almost dropped the phone. "I thank you. Thank you so much." "Don't thank me yet," Miriam warned. "This isn't going to be easy. Ashwood Realty isn't some mom-and-pop shop. They have money, lawyers, influence. They're going to fight this with everything they've got." Leona swallowed. "I don't care." A pause, then a low chuckle from the other end. "All right then, let's get to work." Over the next few days, Leona barely had time to breathe. Miriam had given her an entire stack of documents to review, legal precedents, past cases involving tenant fraud, everything she could possibly need. "You need to understand what you're up against," Miriam had told her. "If you go into that courtroom unprepared, they'll eat you alive." So Leona read and read and read. She spent hours at the library poring over real estate laws, contract loopholes, and fraud cases similar to hers. She highlighted, underlined, took notes until her head ached. And something strange happened. The fear started to fade. The more she read, the more she understood. The more she understood, the stronger she felt. For the first time since this nightmare began, she didn't feel like a victim anymore. She felt like an opponent. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for everyone Ashwood Realty had ever scammed. But just as she started to feel confident, Ashwood Realty fought back. One evening, as she scrolled through her phone, she noticed something unsettling. A news article, Frivolous lawsuit against reputable real estate firm raises questions. She clicked on it, her heart pounding. Leona Graves, a 20-year-old bookstore clerk, has filed a lawsuit against Ashwood Realty, claiming she was misled in a lease agreement. Sources within the company assert that Miss Graves simply failed to read the terms properly and is now attempting to damage the company's reputation. Her breath caught in her throat. It wasn't just a small piece on some obscure website. Several news outlets had picked up the story, each framing her as a naive young woman who didn't understand contracts. She scrolled through the comments. Another entitled kid who thinks the world owes her something? Read your contract next time, sweetheart. Her hands shook. They were smearing her, turning her into the problem. She knew Ashwood Realty had money. She just hadn't realized they had this much influence. Her phone buzzed again. Miriam. You saw it, didn't you? Yeah. Leona's voice was small. Listen to me, kid. This is what they do. They intimidate. They manipulate. They make you feel like you don't stand a chance. But that's what they want. If you back down now, they win. Leona clenched her jaw. I'm not backing down. Good, Miriam said, because they just filed a counterclaim against you. Leona's stomach dropped. They're suing me? Not exactly. They're claiming you've defamed them by filing this lawsuit. They want to scare you into dropping the case. Leona swallowed hard. Can they do that? Not legally, but they can drag this out, make your life hell, drain your resources. Leona had no resources, no money, no legal background, nothing. She felt the fear creeping back in. What do I do? You show up. Leona looked down at the court summons in her inbox. Her first hearing was set. In 2 weeks, she'd be in a courtroom, facing Ashwood Realty, facing Bradley Kent. Leona had never been inside a courtroom before. She'd seen them in movies, imagined them as grand halls of justice where the truth would prevail. But now as she sat beside Miriam Torres in the cold, sterile chamber of the Cook County Courthouse, she realized how different reality was. The room was intimidating, not because of its size, but because of the weight it carried. Rows of polished wooden benches lined the walls, filled with reporters, tenants, and legal observers. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly, casting a pale glow over the long, mahogany judge's bench. And then there was Bradley Kent. He sat on the opposite side of the room, completely at ease. His suit was impeccable, his cufflinks gleamed under the courtroom lights, and he exuded the kind of confidence that came with knowing the system was on his side. Leona's pulse pounded. She had spent weeks preparing for this moment. She had read legal textbooks until the words blurred together. But now, facing the sheer power that Ashwood Realty had behind them, she felt small. The bailiff's voice rang out. All rise for Judge Edwin Mercer. The room stood as the judge entered. Leona's stomach twisted. Judge Mercer was an older man, his sharp blue eyes scanning the room with clear disinterest. He settled into his chair, glanced at the case file, and then, without bothering to mask his annoyance, turned to Leona. Miss Graves, do you even understand what you're doing here? The words hit like a slap. A few quiet chuckles came from Ashwood's table. Leona gritted her teeth. Yes, Your Honor. Mercer sighed, flipping through the paperwork. You've accused Ashwood Realty of fraud. Yet you signed the lease, you agreed to the terms, and now you're claiming you were misled? That seems like poor decision-making on your part, not criminal activity on theirs. Leona's hands clenched into fists beneath the table. Miriam immediately stood up. Your Honor, my client is prepared to present clear evidence that Ashwood Realty engaged in deceptive practices. Mercer held up a hand, cutting her off. Let's not waste the court's time. Mr. Kent, you may present your case. Leona felt her stomach drop. Bradley stood with the ease of a man who had done this 1,000 times before. He adjusted his tie, then turned to the judge with a measured nod. Your Honor, this case is straightforward. Miss Graves entered into a legally binding agreement. The lease explicitly states that the deposit is non-refundable and that unit availability may change at the discretion of the property owner. He walked slowly to the center of the room, addressing the jury and the spectators. Ashwood Realty followed every standard procedure. We notified Miss Graves when the apartment was no longer available. We even offered her a list of alternative units, which she declined. Leona's head snapped up. That was a lie. They had never offered her anything. But Bradley continued, his voice smooth. She now claims fraud. But, Your Honor, the contract speaks for itself. He turned and lifted a thick binder, placing it on the evidence table with a satisfying thud. This is the signed agreement. Every clause was presented clearly, and she accepted each one. Leona felt a wave of doubt crash over her. Had she missed something? Had she really misunderstood the contract? She could feel the jury's perception shifting. She needed something, anything. Then Bradley Kent made a mistake. If you examine the documents, you'll see that every lease follows the same standard structure. There are no irregularities. That word, standard structure, made Leona's breath catch. She froze, her eyes scanning the documents on the table in front of her. Her contract, the one Ashwood Realty had submitted as evidence. Something felt off. She grabbed her pen, flipped through the pages, and then she saw it. A single clause. One that hadn't been in the version she had signed. Her pulse pounded in her ears. They had altered the document. Someone had changed the lease after she signed it. She scribbled a note as fast as she could and slid it across the table to Miriam. Miriam read it. Then she smiled. Your Honor, I'd like to request a side-by-side review of the lease agreements. The one my client signed and the one Ashwood Realty has presented today. Mercer raised an eyebrow. Is there a specific reason for this request, Ms. Torres? Miriam held up the contract. Because these two documents are not the same. A ripple of murmurs spread through the courtroom. Bradley's face stayed neutral, but Leona could see it, the slightest flicker of tension in his jaw. Mercer frowned and gestured for the contracts to be brought forward. Leona held her breath as the judge scanned the pages. Then his expression changed. He had seen it, the discrepancy. Leona's hands tightened into fists beneath the table. She had come in here thinking the system would be against her, and maybe it still was. But facts didn't lie. She had found a crack in their defense, and she wasn't going to stop now. The tension in the courtroom was thick enough to cut through. A silence had fallen over the spectators as Judge Mercer flipped through the pages of the two contracts before him. His expression remained unreadable, but the crease in his brow deepened. Leona held her breath. She had seen it. The discrepancy, the altered clause, the subtle but damning change, and now so had he. Miriam Torres, standing tall beside her, didn't hesitate. Your Honor, as you can see, the contract my client originally signed differs from the one presented by Ashwood Realty. The additional clause regarding unit availability was not in the original document. Judge Mercer exhaled sharply, setting the papers down. Mr. Kent, do you care to explain this? Bradley Kent remained unnervingly calm. He rose, adjusting his suit jacket, before addressing the judge in his usual, measured, authoritative tone. Your Honor, this is nothing more than a clerical error, a simple miscommunication. It happens all the time in large firms. His confidence was unshaken. Leona wanted to scream. A clerical error? That was his defense? Miriam didn't give him room to breathe. A clerical error that conveniently favors your client at the expense of mine? She countered. Bradley Kent hesitated. The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder. People were beginning to see it, the cracks in Ashwood Realty's defense. Judge Mercer rubbed his temples, clearly frustrated. While the discrepancies are concerning, I see no definitive proof that Ashwood Realty acted with malicious intent. Errors in paperwork do occur, and unless there is more evidence proving intent to defraud, this remains a contractual misunderstanding. Leona's heart dropped. Even with the proof in front of him, he was still siding with them. Bradley Kent smirked, ever so slightly. He had expected this. Miriam, however, wasn't finished. Your Honor, this isn't just a single instance. We believe this is part of a pattern, a deliberate systemic practice of altering contracts after signing to defraud tenants. Given the new evidence, I request permission to subpoena additional lease agreements from Ashwood Realty's records. That got Mercer's attention. He looked up sharply. Ms. Torres, do you have any proof of multiple occurrences? Miriam's tone didn't waver. Not yet, but the pattern exists, and I believe further investigation will prove it. The judge considered this for a long moment, drumming his fingers on the desk. Then he sighed. Fine. Your request is granted. Ashwood Realty is to provide additional lease agreements for review. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Leona turned to Miriam, eyes wide. Wait, does that mean? It means, Miriam said with a small smile, we just bought ourselves a second chance. The courtroom emptied slowly, the weight of what had just happened settling over everyone. Leona exhaled, pressing her hands against the cool wooden table in front of her. Her legs felt unsteady, her nerves still raw from the confrontation. She hadn't won, not yet, but it felt like she could. She turned to Miriam. You really think they'll hand over those documents? Miriam scoffed. They'll fight it. They might even try to destroy them. But now we have the court watching. Leona glanced across the room. Bradley Kent was speaking to his team, his expression no longer as confident as before. She had rattled him. Ashwood Realty wasn't untouchable. Leona sat on the worn-out couch in Miriam's office, staring at the stack of papers spread out before her. The fluorescent lights above buzzed softly, casting a cold glow over the legal documents that had become the center of her world. She should have felt relieved. She should have felt victorious. After all, they had proven that Ashwood Realty had altered her contract. The court had agreed to investigate further, but the weight in her chest told her otherwise. Judge Mercer had hesitated, but in the end, he hadn't ruled in her favor. He had left the door open for Ashwood Realty to defend itself, and worse, he had placed the burden of proof back on her shoulders. And Bradley Kent? He had doubled down. Within 24 hours, he had filed additional documents claiming that the altered clause had always been part of Ashwood Realty's standard leasing agreements. He had produced testimonies from former tenants who claimed they had never experienced fraud, and now he had brought in a witness, a man named Howard Dixon, a former property manager at Ashwood Realty, a man willing to swear under oath that Ashwood Realty had never engaged in deceptive leasing practices. Leona's stomach churned as she read through his statement. I was responsible for processing lease agreements for over 5 years. At no point did I witness any alterations to tenant contracts after signing. The claims made by Miss Graves are baseless and harmful to the company's reputation. Leona clenched her fists. Lies. But the truth wouldn't matter if she couldn't prove it. She exhaled sharply, rubbing her temples. They're closing in on us. Miriam, who had been quietly flipping through a separate folder, didn't look up. Of course they are. They have the money, the lawyers, the influence. They know how to bury cases like this. Leona looked at her. Then what do we do? Miriam finally met her gaze. We find someone who will tell the truth. For the next few days, Leona barely slept. Miriam had told her that the key to taking down Ashwood Realty wasn't just proving that they altered her contract, it was proving that they had done it before. That meant finding other victims. She spent hours scrolling through online forums, tenant complaint sites, even old social media posts, searching for anyone who had a story like hers. Most people had the same problem. Deposits taken, contracts changed, no refunds, but no one wanted to talk. Most of them had moved on. Some were afraid. Others had taken settlements and signed non-disclosure agreements, making them legally unable to speak. It felt hopeless. Then Miriam called her. I think I found someone. Leona waited anxiously at a coffee shop off West Madison. The place was nearly empty, the sound of jazz playing softly through the speakers. A waitress refilled her coffee, and she wrapped her hands around the warm mug, trying to keep herself from spiraling into doubt. Then the door swung open. A man walked in, hesitated, then spotted her. Daniel Ricks. He looked to be in his late 30s, with tired eyes and the kind of nervous energy that came from knowing too much. He slid into the seat across from her. Torres said you needed someone who knows what goes on inside Ashwood Realty. Leona nodded. I need the truth. Daniel let out a slow breath, staring at his untouched coffee. I worked for them for almost 7 years. I processed leases, handled tenant complaints. I saw everything. He paused. And yeah, I saw the fraud. Leona's heart leapt into her throat. You're saying they did this before? Daniel let out a bitter laugh. They've been doing it for years. She leaned forward. Can you prove it? Daniel hesitated. Then he reached into his jacket and pulled out his phone. He scrolled for a moment, then turned the screen toward her. An email thread, the subject line, Lease Amendments, Internal Use Only. Leona's fingers tightened around her coffee cup. She skimmed the emails. They weren't just about her case. There were dozens of names. Leona looked up, her pulse racing. Daniel, if you testify, this could change everything. He exhaled, rubbing his face. I don't know if I can. These people, they don't play fair. If I go against them, I could lose everything. Leona swallowed hard. What about the people who already lost everything? Daniel didn't answer, but he didn't walk away either. The courtroom was packed. Leona had expected more people this time, but even she was surprised by how many had shown up. The air felt heavier, thick with murmurs and the faint clicking of reporters' cameras. Unlike the first trial, this wasn't just another tenant dispute anymore. This had become a battle with stakes far beyond her own case. As she walked past the rows of spectators, she caught glimpses of familiar faces, people who had reached out after her story broke, tenants who had been cheated just like her. Some gave her small nods of encouragement. Others just watched, their expressions unreadable. This was bigger than just her now. Miriam, as composed as ever, adjusted her blazer before leaning toward Leona. Nervous? Leona swallowed hard. Would it be stupid to say no? Miriam smirked. It'd be a lie. On the other side of the courtroom, Bradley Kent was already seated, looking just as polished and smug as ever. He had a new assistant today, a younger man furiously flipping through documents, probably calculating their next move. They still thought they could bury this case. Leona wasn't going to let that happen. Judge Mercer entered and the room fell silent. Court is now in session. Leona took a deep breath. This was it. Miriam stood first, stepping forward with a confidence that filled the entire room. Your Honor, in the previous hearing, we discovered that Ashwood Realty had altered my client's lease after she had signed it. Today we bring forth evidence that this was not an isolated incident, but rather a pattern of fraud that has affected multiple tenants. A murmur spread through the room. Miriam handed the bailiff a thick stack of contracts, placing them before the judge. We have here over 20 lease agreements from Ashwood Realty, all showing the exact same type of modification, additional clauses inserted after tenants had signed. She turned toward Bradley Kent. Mr. Kent, how do you explain this level of clerical error? Bradley didn't flinch. If anything, he seemed amused. He rose slowly, buttoning his jacket, exuding the same practiced calm he had before. Your Honor, he began, as I stated previously, no fraudulent activity took place. The contracts presented by the plaintiff have minor administrative inconsistencies, but that does not equate to an intentional scheme to deceive tenants. He gestured toward the documents. What my colleague fails to mention is that in real estate, changes to lease terms occur frequently. Property availability fluctuates. Adjustments must be made. These discrepancies amount to nothing more than routine corrections. Leona gritted her teeth. Routine corrections? That's how he was spinning this? Miriam wasn't done. So you're saying it's just a coincidence, she said coolly, that all these contracts just happen to change in the exact same way, always in favor of Ashwood Realty, always after tenants had signed? Bradley smiled. Mistakes happen, Ms. Torres. That's business. Leona felt sick. It was happening again. The system was bending in his favor, just like before. But then Miriam straightened. Your Honor, the defense would like you to believe this is just an unfortunate paperwork issue, but we have someone who can prove otherwise. She turned. The plaintiff calls Daniel Ricks to the stand. A ripple of whispers filled the room. Leona's heart pounded as she watched Daniel step forward. Bradley Kent's demeanor shifted instantly. His casual confidence evaporated, his smirk replaced by a look of genuine concern. Leona had never seen him rattled before. Daniel took his seat, adjusting the microphone in front of him. The bailiff swore him in, and then Miriam approached. Mr. Ricks, could you state your previous position at Ashwood Realty for the court? Daniel cleared his throat. I was a compliance officer in the legal department. I reviewed lease agreements before they were finalized. And during your time there, did you ever witness any irregularities? A pause. Then Daniel exhaled and nodded. Yes, I did. The entire room stilled. Could you elaborate? Miriam pressed. Daniel hesitated, glancing toward the Ashwood table. For a moment, Leona worried he would back out. Then he reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out a printed email chain. "I have records." Miriam took the papers, handing them to the bailiff. "What do these records show, Mr. Ricks?" Daniel met Judge Mercer's gaze. "They show that Ashwood Realty intentionally altered lease agreements after tenants signed, and that I was instructed to approve them without informing the tenants." A collective gasp filled the room. Miriam turned to Judge Mercer. "Your Honor, we now have internal documentation proving that Ashwood Realty's actions were not just clerical errors, but a systemic effort to manipulate lease agreements for financial gain." Bradley Kent's face changed. He leaned forward, his jaw tight, his fingers gripping the edge of the table. "Objection, Your Honor," he said quickly, but his voice wasn't as steady as before. "This evidence is incomplete and irrelevant to the plaintiff's specific case." Judge Mercer held up a hand. "Overruled." Bradley stiffened. Judge Mercer flipped through the emails, his expression slowly darkening. Leona held her breath. Then Mercer's tone shifted. "Mr. Kent, is there an explanation for why your company's legal department was instructed to modify contracts without informing tenants?" Bradley didn't answer right away. Then he straightened, clearing his throat. "Your Honor, I will need time to review these claims." He was stalling because he had no answer. Leona felt her fingers tighten into fists beneath the table. She had him. She wasn't just fighting back anymore. She was winning. The courtroom had never felt heavier. Every eye was on Judge Mercer, waiting. The tension wrapped around Leona's chest like a vice, tightening with every second that passed. This was it. The moment that would decide everything. She could hear the faint clicking of reporters' keyboards, the murmurs from the spectators, the restless shifting of the jury. But all she could focus on was Bradley Kent, standing just a few feet away, still wearing that calculated, unreadable expression. She wasn't afraid of him anymore. Miriam turned to her, nodding. "It's time." Leona rose. Her legs felt like lead. Her heart pounded so hard she thought everyone in the room could hear it, but she didn't let it show. She stepped forward, faced Judge Mercer, and then she spoke. "Your Honor, I know I'm not a lawyer." Her voice was steady, but there was an edge to it now, a force that hadn't been there before. "I don't have years of legal training, and I certainly don't have the money or power that Mr. Kent and Ashwood Realty have. But I do have something that matters even more than that." She turned, facing the jury now. "I have the truth." She let the words settle. "I signed a contract in good faith, just like dozens of others who have come forward. I did everything right, and yet I was lied to. My contract was altered after I signed it. My deposit was taken. I was left without a home, and I wasn't the only one." She let her gaze scan the room, landing on the other victims who had come to watch. Some had tears in their eyes. Some clenched their fists. All of them had been waiting, desperate for someone to say what they couldn't. Ashwood Realty thinks they can get away with this because they always have, because they know how to manipulate the system, because they think people like me don't have the means to fight back. Her voice hardened. "But if the law is really fair, if it truly stands for justice, then today, that stops." Silence. For the first time since this trial started, Bradley Kent didn't have a smug retort. He shifted, adjusting his tie, but the confidence in his posture had finally cracked. Miriam glanced at her, an almost imperceptible smile on her lips. Leona had won the room. Bradley Kent tried to fight back. "This is all very emotional," he began, his voice measured. "But emotions do not equate to evidence. The facts remain. Ashwood Realty operated within the law. Any errors in documentation were simply that. Errors. Miss Graves is exploiting this for personal gain, attempting to turn an administrative issue into a full-blown scandal." His words rang hollow. No one was convinced anymore. Judge Mercer rubbed his temple, clearly torn. The old Mercer, the one who had dismissed Leona at the start of the trial, might have been swayed by Bradley's argument. But not now. Not after Daniel Ricks's testimony. Not after the emails exposing Ashwood Realty's fraud. Not after Leona stood up and refused to be silenced. The judge sighed heavily. Then at last he spoke. "After reviewing the evidence presented and considering the testimonies given, this court finds Ashwood Realty liable for fraudulent leasing practices." A collective gasp filled the room. Leona's breath hitched. The court orders Ashwood Realty to pay restitution to all tenants affected by these fraudulent leases. Furthermore, this case will be referred to the state attorney's office for potential criminal investigation into corporate misconduct. The room erupted. Reporters scrambled for their notes. The victims who had been cheated by Ashwood Realty clasped hands, whispering in shock and relief. And Leona? She felt lightheaded, dizzy. She had won. She had actually won. Her knees threatened to buckle, but Miriam's firm hand found her shoulder. "Breathe, kid," Leona inhaled sharply. "I did it," Miriam smirked. "You didn't just do it. You changed everything." Bradley Kent stormed out of the courtroom before the reporters could swarm him. His face was unreadable, but he looked like a man who had lost. Ashwood Realty would try to spin this, of course. They would file appeals, hire PR firms, try to make the public forget. But this time, they wouldn't be able to bury it. Too many people had seen the truth. Too many people were watching now. As Leona stepped outside the courthouse, a flood of reporters surged forward. "Miss Graves, how does it feel to take down a real estate giant? Do you think this case will lead to larger industry reform? What's next for you?" Leona hesitated. She had spent so long just trying to survive this battle. She hadn't thought about what came after. She caught sight of a small group of tenants watching her from a distance. People who had almost given up hope. People who had been ignored until now. And suddenly she knew the answer. She turned to the cameras, her lips curling into a quiet but certain smile. This is just the beginning. The courthouse steps felt strangely surreal beneath Leona's feet. The past few weeks had been a blur of research, depositions, and courtroom battles. Now with the case won, she should have felt nothing but relief. But as she stepped outside into the crisp Chicago air, an odd sense of emptiness settled in her chest. This wasn't just her victory anymore. It was theirs. For every tenant who had been cheated, for everyone who had been told they didn't matter, for every person who had ever been ignored. A wave of people waited for her. Some were reporters holding out microphones, shouting her name, but it was the faces beyond them that caught her attention. A woman in her 60s clutching a printed-out lease in her trembling hands, tears welling in her eyes. A young father holding his daughter, whispering something to her before he gave Leona a grateful nod. A man in his 70s, his face lined with age and hardship, stepping forward and gripping her hand firmly. "You did something I never thought was possible." Leona swallowed the lump in her throat. "You gave us a chance." And just like that, the weight in her chest lifted. She hadn't just won a lawsuit. She had changed something. Ashwood Realty was falling apart. The headlines came fast. Major real estate firm under federal investigation for widespread tenant fraud. Leona Graves versus Ashwood Realty, a landmark case for renters' rights. Lawyer Bradley Kent suspended pending review of legal misconduct. Leona had heard that Ashwood's CEO had stepped down, trying to distance himself from the scandal. But the damage had been done. The lawsuits kept coming. The city had launched an independent review of past rental agreements. And Bradley Kent, he had been hit hardest of all. His license was suspended pending investigation. The prestigious law firm he had once been so proud of had quietly removed his name from their website. Leona wondered what was worse for a man like him, losing his career or losing his untouchable status. And Judge Mercer? He hadn't been removed from the bench, but the scandal had tarnished him. People were watching him now. His career wouldn't be the same. When the courtroom had emptied out, he had glanced at her one last time, but there was no condescension in his eyes this time, just acknowledgement. A week later, Leona sat in a small cafe, stirring her coffee absent-mindedly. She had nothing to research, no legal documents to read, no deadlines looming over her. It felt wrong, like she had been running a marathon, only to suddenly stop. The bell above the door chimed. She looked up as Miriam Torres slid into the seat across from her, setting down her own steaming cup of coffee. "You look lost, kid." Leona exhaled a soft laugh. "I don't know what to do now." Miriam arched an eyebrow. "I do." She slid a manila envelope across the table. "Consider it a job offer." Leona blinked. "A job?" Miriam smirked. "Not a job. A legal internship. You're still not a lawyer, Graves. But you've got the instincts, and that's harder to teach." Leona hesitated, her fingers hovering over the envelope. You think I'd be any good at it? Miriam leaned back, studying her. You just took down an entire real estate empire without a law degree. What do you think? Leona grinned. She knew her answer. Later that evening, she sat alone in a small park bench, watching the city lights flicker on. She thought about her mother, about all the times she had told her to stand up for herself, to never let the world decide her worth. She wished she could call her, tell her everything, but instead she whispered softly to the night air, I did it, Mom, and she felt at peace. The next morning, a headline made its way through social media. Leona Graves, the young woman who took on a real estate giant and won. She skimmed the article, saw the way people talked about her now. Some called her a fighter. Some called her lucky. Some called her a troublemaker. She didn't care what they called her, because she knew exactly who she was now. She wasn't just a girl who had been scammed out of an apartment. She was someone who fought back. And she was just getting started. As she stepped into Miriam's law office, she felt something different. She wasn't a victim walking into a courtroom anymore. She wasn't just another name on a lease. She was here to make a difference. She reached for the door handle, took a deep breath, and stepped inside. Justice isn't just for those with power, it's for those willing to fight for it. Leona Graves didn't have money, influence, or a law degree, but she had determination. And sometimes that's enough to change everything. So what would you do if the system failed you? Would you walk away or stand up and fight? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories of resilience, justice, and the power of one voice.